Hello and welcome to this session on geopolitics and China. I'm Terry Martin. We have, I think, about 45 minutes for this discussion that we're going to try to address this huge topic. I'll quickly introduce our guests and get moving. Right next to me is James Lindsay. James M. Lindsay of the United States is Senior Vice President and Director of Studies, and Maurice R. Greenberg Chair at the Council on Foreign Relations. Next to him, Qingguo from China is Professor of International Studies at Peking University, member of the Standing Committee of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference as well. Hugo Dixon from the UK is a commentator at large for the news agency Reuters. Many might know him from the Lex column, first at Financial Times, but also, of course, Breaking Views, which is his signature. So we've been given the honor of addressing the teeny tiny topic of geopolitics and China with no further elaboration of what we should be focusing on. Now, this is a topic that obviously concerns the core theme of this conference, which is the Great Transition, because it's widely believed that the center of gravity in the world is shifting away from the West, particularly the United States, and towards its declared rival, China. Now, China, to kind of set this up for our discussion as a starting point, I'll just quickly sketch out how many see the status quo. It's kind of set the scene. So, China is seen as ascendant. Its economy has grown fantastically in recent decades, lifting millions out of poverty, attracting an astounding amount of foreign direct investment, which in turn has fueled technological progress. Beijing's model of state capitalism has enabled it to gain virtual monopolies in key sectors on a global scale. Its trade, lending, and foreign investment policies have created economic dependencies in many countries, and some would say de facto client states. And its growing economic weight translates into political influence. Autocrats, not least those in post-colonial countries, have been emboldened. So that's that view. But now we're witnessing a backlash. For many in the West, this is perceived as a threat, posing a potentially existential challenge to the Western model of liberal democracy that values human rights, fair trade, and a rules-based international order. Leaders in North America, Europe, Australia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and elsewhere are deeply worried. They fear that their way of life will be jeopardized and crushed in a world dominated by an aggressive, repressive, autocratic superpower. They see China's support for their adversaries, above all Russia, as a direct threat and are now pursuing a policy of what they call de-risking. Let's not say decoupling. And they are alarmed at opinion polls showing an erosion of public support, even in democracies, for the democratic model, and more taking a favorable view of autocracy on the basis of China's success. So, now I'm putting that on the table as a starting point for the discussion. Gentlemen, is that a fair description of the status quo? How do you see it? And I'd like to get Qingguo to first comment on this.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to come here. And also, this is my first time to Delphi. It's such a wonderful place. Well, I think the topic of today's discussion is China's geopolitical ambitions. What are the geopolitical ambitions of China? Years ago, two European officials came to my school and they asked a question. They said, in history, when a big country experienced economic growth, rapid economic growth, it invariably became expansionist. Okay? Will China be an exception? 20 years later, a lot of people in the US especially, and in the West, draw the conclusion that China has become a geo-expansionist power. Okay. The reality, however, is very complicated. China has become expansionist, but not in geopolitical terms, rather in economic terms. Okay? China has developed vast trade relations with countries all over the world. It has become a major investor and is becoming a major international market. So it has expanded in that way, not in terms of military expansion, as the old powers used to do. Okay. Today we are talking about a lot of talk about South China Sea, East China Sea. Okay. Sure, China has become more assertive in defending its alleged claims, its claims of those territories and economic interests, maritime economic interests. However, China has never expanded its territorial claims. Okay. Chinese government has been under tremendous pressure to defend its territorial claims rather than expand its territorial claims. Okay. So there is a big difference here. Also, China's military has expanded tremendously over the past decades. Okay. Why? China has three or four major security concerns. One is Taiwan independence. Okay. After DPP came to power, this became urgent. Okay. China regarded Taiwan as part of China. Okay. Anybody who wants to split China away is regarded as a national traitor and has to be deterred and defeated. So China needs the military to make sure that Taiwan is not separate from China. And also, Taiwan authorities have the support of the US. And China has to develop enough military capabilities to make sure that the US will not intervene if China has to use force to stop Taiwan from becoming independent.
Okay. We could leave it there for now so we can bring in the other guests. It didn't take us very long to get to Taiwan. That doesn't surprise me. But I'm sure we'll pick up on it as we go along. But I would still, given this scenario that I sketched out at the beginning, I'd like to get the responses from the other two panelists. James Lindsay, next.
Terry, let me say I accept what you laid out in the main. I would offer some slight amendments, friendly amendments, if I may. I don't believe, as we look at what is happening right now, that there is a transfer or shift from the West to China. I think what we're witnessing is a shift from the West to Asia writ large. And I think in the prior panel talked a great deal about the problems of economic growth in Europe, and that is very real. But again, Asia itself is quite dynamic, now constitutes more than 40% of global economic output. I will also note that the United States is not just a transatlantic nation, it is also a Pacific nation. Go to California, they will point to the body of water lapping up in their coast and make that point. Second thing I would just sort of say about looking at the evolution of what has happened is that from Washington's vantage point, it had hoped to be in a position in which it avoided having a confrontation with China. The fundamental premise of American policy toward China from the early 1990s till about 2017 was this notion that the United States would be able to, by encouraging China to enter the international economic order, to have it become a responsible stakeholder in the existing world order. That goal, that strategy did not work. Some people in the United States would argue we should never have tried it. Others would say it was worth trying, but when we got warning signs early on, we ignored them in going forward. And I appreciate the brief that my Chinese colleague has put forward, but I think it's relatively kind to the Chinese position. It is true, as China defines its territorial remit, it has not expanded. However, I would note the Taiwanese, the Indians, virtually every country in the South China Sea would argue that China is making claims to territory they do not, in fact, have a claim to. Most notably, the claim to basically waters that prior or previously, or by most other countries, are recognized to belong to the Philippines. And it is hard not to look at what is going on right now in the second Thomas Shoal, where the Chinese ships have been basically turning water cannons on Philippine resupply vessels trying to resupply the outpost there. So I think it's a bit more complicated than the professor laid out.
So we've got complexity on the table in multiple ways. James Lindsay just suggested that China is not a responsible stakeholder in the international order. I'm sure that we can get a response from that in a moment. But first, let's bring in Hugo Dixon with your response to this scenario I sketched out at the beginning.
Well, I'm closer to James in respect to where sort of China's ambitions are. I think it's correct, as Qing said, that we're not talking about China expanding per se, but it's in a whole series of territorial disputes with its neighbors, from the Himalayas through the South China Sea, through the East China Sea. And if it is able to dominate, basically turn the East China and South China Sea into Chinese lakes, then that has a massive impact on the whole of East Asia and, by extension, on America and Europe. So that's the first thing I'd say. The second thing is that you talked about sort of Chinese economic growth and going from strength to strength. I think that the picture has shifted quite dramatically. And certainly, I mean, okay, Europe is not in a good shape, as we just heard. But if you compare the outlook for China to the outlook for America over the coming decades, I would say it's going to be a sort of neck-and-neck race, actually, because, I mean, first of all, the Chinese growth statistics are almost certainly exaggerated, and then they've got a lot of headwinds, demographics among one thing, you know, the suppression of animal spirits and entrepreneurship on the other hand, the need to change their economic model dramatically. So when you put that together, and of course the American demographics are going in the opposite direction, I think that it's quite likely that China will get caught in a particular form of middle-income trap, which will mean that it, for the foreseeable future, and maybe forever, it will never catch up on America. On the other hand, if I was sitting in Beijing, I would be looking at the geopolitical situation actually quite favorably. I would be thinking that when America was last distracted by wars that weren't really part of its grand strategy, Iraq and Afghanistan, that was a time when China made big leaps forward in terms of geopolitical and economic strength. Now we've got America entangled and distracted by Ukraine and by Gaza. It's quite possible that Russia will make a breakthrough in Ukraine, which will be hugely beneficial, not just for Russia, but also for China. And the way that America is being, I think, rightly accused of double standards in Gaza is undermining America's position with the global South. And that, again, plays to the narrative of China that US hegemony is not good for large parts of the developing world. Now, I don't completely buy that narrative, but there is actually quite a lot of truth to that narrative. It's a mixed picture, but certainly what's happening in Gaza is playing to the Chinese narrative. So that would be my perspective.
Good. We've got a lot on the table here already. What I would like to kind of bring it back to more concrete where things are now and where they might be heading in the short and medium term. China is convinced that its economy is growing in such a way that despite current bumps that it's having, particularly in the property market and demographic challenges, that it will overtake the United States. This is an assumption that by mid-century at least. if not before. I want to ask.
Overall size of the economy, not by per capita.
Yeah, there are different ways of measuring it. Some would say it's already bigger, right? Anyway, we don't have to.
Let's say in dollar terms.
Exactly.
Or in renminbi terms.
I want to bring in Qingguo Jia on the question of something I noted that Chinese leader Xi Jinping said in December. He noted that the world has entered a new period of turbulence and transformation, and he said, in which major country diplomacy with Chinese characteristics will enter a new stage where much more can be accomplished. And I was just wondering, can you tell us what that means? What is major country diplomacy with Chinese characteristics?
Okay. Well, first of all, Chinese perception of the international environment is not as favorable as you suggested. Actually, it's, in China we say 风高浪急, strong wind and high waves. It's quite dangerous place.
Yeah.
And secondly, I think when Xi Jinping came up with the saying that we need to build major power relations, it was referring to, at the beginning it was referring to the US, okay? So how should we develop a sort of constructive relationship? We need to do three things. One is mutual respect, no war, mutual respect, and also mutual benefit. Okay? So this is the essence of what he calls the major power relations. We should not engage in unnecessary competition and especially vilification of each other. Okay.
You mentioned no war, and so far, thank goodness, this has held. But there are wars going on in the world, including Ukraine, not that far from where we are on the European continent, and China's position regarding Russia on that intervention in Ukraine, I mean, is arguably tacitly endorsing or accepting that kind of intervention. I'm just wondering quickly whether you can respond to that.
Well, first of all, China has never endorsed Russia's military operations against Ukraine. Actually, it has taken a neutral position. Basically,
it's not condemned either.
Huh?
Right? It's not condemned
right.
either.
It has publicly expressed a different view on Russia's claims. But at the same time, it has felt uncomfortable to condemn Russia. Why? We all know the reason. Right? The U.S. and its West is perceived to be hostile against China. And why should China alienate itself from another power by, doing so? Neutrality. This is the policy U.S. conducted before the Pearl Harbor, right? In face of fascist invasion of Europe, the U.S. did not do very much until the Japanese launched this sudden attack against Pearl Harbor. So it's nothing new. It's a self-interest kind of policy.
So we may come back to that. Of course, that's a whole topic in itself, right? We could do a whole panel on this subject. But again, bring it back to kind of the geopolitical context. There's talk of now the notion of the global South and BRICS states, which includes China, kind of forming an antipole to the West, however one wants to define that as liberal democracies. We've got Xi Jinping skipping the G20 and going to the BRICS summit instead. In South Africa, a country that holds joint military exercises with China and Russia. I was just wondering, James Lindsay, first of all, do you see a signal being sent there?
Being sent by?
By Xi Jinping by not attending the G20 this year or last year, but instead going to the BRICS summit.
Well, let's begin. We clearly have geopolitical competition between the United States and China. It's undeniable. The hopes that we had seen the death of geopolitics after the collapse of the Soviet Union has been shown to be naive. Just a quick point here. I want to just emphasize something that Hugh said about China being stuck in this middle income trap. This is a very real problem. You alluded to, Terry, sort of the property issues, development issues, investments in China. That's not a minor problem. That is a huge problem. And the Chinese government is trying to escape it by exporting its way out of the problem. It is not going to succeed. It is alarming virtually every one of its trading partners. It's not just the United States. It's all of Europe. It is Brazil. It is India. So that is a flashpoint. You can't sort of cut the economics out of geopolitics and ignore it. So I just wanted to flag that. In terms of the geopolitical competition, I listened to what the professor said, and what I will note is his argument was very artfully crafted. China hasn't endorsed the Russian invasion, but in fact it hasn't criticized it. And that's notable because China, for decades, probably going all the way back to the foundation of the People's Republic of China, has argued that national sovereignty is sacrosanct. And clearly Ukraine's sovereignty has been violated, and China has been unwilling to do anything about it. In fact, while there is no overt support, it's very clear right now that Chinese entities, firms, are helping to supply the Russian war effort. And this is a growing issue in tensions between the United States and Washington going forward. But certainly from the vantage point of Washington, you can look at a whole slew of issues where you could imagine China playing a much more constructive role, and it hasn't. In part because China is hoping, my view, that these issues, chaos, Xi Jinping called it in one of his speeches, is going to play to China's advantage, that it is going to weaken and hamstring and perhaps bring an end to America's superpower role in the world. But we can point to the issues. The Chinese reaction to Hamas's attack on Israel was to flood social media with anti-Israeli, anti-American messages. The Chinese could have stepped up their good offices with Iran, with whom they have extensive economic relations, to ask them to rein in Iran's support for resistance groups in the region. China most notably has not sought to put pressure on the Houthis in Yemen to stop the attacks on shipping through the Red Sea, even though China is a major exporter and presumably has an interest in seeing sea shipping going through. I may have offended the wind gods, I apologize. Beyond that, there's some evidence that China has in fact been paying off the Houthis not to attack Chinese flag shipping. And we can go down a list of things in which the Chinese could be much more helpful in the international community, and they're not, because they see this turmoil as serving China's greater issues. And if I were to sort of sum up Xi Jinping's strategy, it's not that he wants to establish global Chinese hegemony. What he really wants to do, and this is not original to me, is to establish a unipolar Asia and a multipolar world. China wants to dominate its neighborhood. And much of what's being done is to push the United States out of the Western Pacific.
Can I come in just to try to answer your direct question about this, the BRICS and the competition for the global South? First of all, I'd say I don't think the BRICS themselves have achieved very much, and I don't think that the expansion of the BRICS will achieve very much. Several countries, important countries, didn't join. Indonesia didn't join, Argentina isn't joining. And they got countries like Egypt and Ethiopia, which don't really add up to much, certainly economically. There is a huge battle going on. China is, with its Belt and Road Initiative, got way ahead. Now that's running into some bad debt problems. the West has its rival scheme, which I helped create, the Partnership for Growth, for Global Infrastructure and Investment. It was originally launched by the British government when we had the G7. That hasn't really taken off. So I would say that the Chinese are still ahead in that game. In terms of other alliances, it's quite mixed. It's quite interesting. I think that large parts of Southeast Asia are still up for play. It's very interesting, the move that Biden made with Vietnam, and the alliance with the Philippines has certainly got a lot stronger. The triangular relationship between America, Japan, and South Korea is also very important. And then all of these things like AUKUS and JAUKUS and whatever. So all of that is coming along. So I think it's very much in contention. But I come back to what I said right at the start, which is that if the Ukraine war goes the wrong way for the West, that will dwarf what is being done in the rest of the world. Because America's allies in the rest of the world, they'll say, well, you know, you couldn't even stand up for Ukraine. We're going to start hedging ourselves, hedging our bets. We certainly don't want to get on the wrong side of China, et cetera, et cetera. So that is, I think, is the critical thing that overshadows everything else, and Gaza playing also an important subsidiary role.
Very, very quick point, yeah.
The hedging has already begun, because there are concerns about the constancy of American leadership in the world. And we're seeing it, and obviously questions being raised of what will American foreign policy look like in February of 2025 if Donald Trump wins. So I think that issue of the hedging. On your specific question of the Global South, I don't know that it's a useful concept, because in the Global South, countries take many different positions. And of course, one always has to differentiate between what countries say and what they do. And many of these countries are quite willing, understandably pursuing their national interests, to pick what looks to be the best deal for them.
Yeah, I mean, we've been, of course, I'll bring you in just a moment. I just would say that, you know, we are sketching out strong winds indeed. As you said, they are blowing here today in Delphi. But we're sketching out something of a bipolar world here, which may or may not be the case. But we certainly do have these two incredible powers that are declared rivals, at least from a U.S. perspective. China says it wants to have a win-win sort of situation, but there's a lot of skepticism towards that, as we've heard from James Lindsay just now. Many are saying, however, that there's also a kind of, we see ad hoc alliances that are forming as we move forward, and that there's a great disruption in the structures that were there before, and it's still being sorted out, and it's not really clear how this is all going. As you say, there are many countries that are simply not really clearly aligned yet. We don't know where they're going. I wanted to get back again to where China, how China sees the world, because we're talking about China in a geopolitical context. And, Professor, I'm sorry that you're the only representative of China on this panel, so I do address these questions to you. But there was the National People's Congress that just took place in China. Some interesting comments made there. The government outlined its ambitions to reform the global governance system. I wanted to ask you about that. What would China's preferred system of global governance look like?
Well, first of all, I want to say that the strategic competition between China and the U.S. Is U.S. term, American term. Americans are saying we want to, we are engaged in a strategic competition. China has never said where China is willing to engage in such kind of strategic competition.
There.
De facto, China is reacting very much to the U.S. imposed strategic competition. Secondly, what kind of global governance China envisions? I think specifically, China wants more equality in global governance. Okay. There are certain things that were made decisions were made policies were made in the wake of the Second World War, okay, and very unequal. For example, why should World Bank be headed by an American and the IMF should be headed by a European? What are the reasons for that? There are many other things that China feels that the international institutions should be reformed to reflect the current situation rather than to stick to the old arrangements. But China is supportive of the international organizations, especially the UN and UN Security Council. China argues that whatever you do, especially when you use force, it has to be approved by the UN Security Council. But you're talking about violating the rule-based order. I think the violation is often taken place when the U.S. wants to do something, whether it's the Second Gulf War or many other military operations overseas.
Yeah, I mean, there are many rules in the rules-based international order. But on the financial side, it was very interesting. We just had the U.S. Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, in China, claiming that China has developed overcapacities in certain industrial sectors, and which is not playing kind of by fair rules in the world. I don't want to spend much time on that. We have about 11 minutes left, so I want to stick with the geopolitical part, continuing to plug in the economics, of course. I know Hugo has been reflecting a lot on that. I'm thinking about the de-risking strategy that the United States and Europe are openly pursuing in their relations with China. This is trying to change supply chains. They learned during COVID and otherwise that there are some big issues there about dependencies on China when it comes to all sorts of things. We can enumerate them if you will. But I'm just wondering what you make of that de-risking strategy, gentlemen, and where that's going. Is it realistic, and what will it result in? Let's start with you, Hugo.
Well, I think the first thing to say is it's not just the West that's de-risking from China, it's also China that's de-risking from the West. And I think that is, unfortunately, a reality of the situation where neither side trusts the other. But given the realities, it makes sense. And the issue is how to minimize the damage. And this is why I think that the motto "de-risk but not decouple" is right in general, but then you have to look at the detail of it. And I do think that, particularly from a Western perspective and a European perspective, seeing what a terrible mess we got into by overdependence on Russian gas, it makes sense not to be overdependent on China. And vice versa. I would say that in this overcapacity, now what's happened, I think, is that there is a bit of a risk that this starts to spread and spread and spread. And it's not just a matter of trade, it's also a matter of investment. In fact, the decoupling in investment has so far been, I think, more dramatic than in trade. That is in new investment flows, obviously not the stock of investment. And I think it started really from the Western perspective with more of a tech focus, a sort of chips and computers. It's now clearly moved into green technology, solar panels, batteries, electric vehicles. Europe is also completely running scared that its car industry is going to be decimated. So I sort of understand, to some extent, Janet Yellen's comments. But from another perspective, from the planet's perspective, do we really want China to stop producing so many solar panels, so many wind turbines, so many batteries, so many electric vehicles? Last year, precisely because of this overcapacity, solar panel prices and battery prices virtually halved. I actually have started to call this the good green glut.
Good green glut. Okay, well, that's putting an optimistic view on it. China has developed capacities in the processing of critical minerals that, I mean, I really wonder how the West, America and Europe are really going to overcome that moving forward. But anyway, we're getting into some very specific things there. What about China's current economic difficulties? You mentioned that earlier, Hugo. I'm just wondering how you see that, Professor, with regard to China's property market, the demographics that we see in the country, some of the struggles that it's running into. How serious is that for your country, and how will it affect your ability to project power?
Well, I think it's quite serious. The government has adopted a lot of measures to deal with it, and is still considering more measures to address the problem. There are many reasons for this. If you ask economists, they can tell you a whole range of reasons, ranging from aging to bad policies, and whether China can overcome this in the near term, I think China has a chance to overcome this in the near term. So nothing is determined. So the argument that China's economic growth has reached the peak, and now what you can expect, all you can expect is China is going to on a downslope path. I think that view is too linear and unjustified. In history, we saw this bouncing back several times.
Sure, things go up and down, and the world is in a state of flux. We have 5 minutes left. I want to get into kind of the harder, more nitty-gritty questions regarding power and regarding concerns in conflicts. You say that China wants a peaceful world. I mean, I think we all want world peace. But right now we do have some conflicts that are testing that. We heard the Polish foreign minister here at this forum yesterday saying that China is the only country that can convince Vladimir Putin to leave Russia, to withdraw his forces from Russia. James Lindsay, do you believe that?
Ukraine.
Sorry, for Ukraine, excuse me. No, that would be interesting.
Russia.
No, okay, sorry, Ukraine, of course.
I think Beijing has enormous power to shape many of these conflicts. We have not seen the Chinese government seek to exercise that influence. And just to tie it back to the economic conversation we just had, for geopolitics, I don't think it really matters whether China grows at 2.5%, 3%, 5%. China is powerful. It is a factor in the world. It will have a say. Regrettably, I think, and we can go down a number of issues, the Chinese have not sought to use their power to shape things, clearly are not using it with Russia. And that's a calculation that the Chinese have made. Again, it's inconsistent with their long-standing argument that sovereignty is the foremost principle in world politics. And yes, I agree with the Polish foreign minister. If they were to put pressure on Russia, it would certainly change Vladimir Putin's calculation. Enough to make Putin stop, I don't know. Countries can go forward in the face of a lot of pressure. But the notable thing is we see no Chinese pressure. As I mentioned a moment ago, a lot of evidence that China is facilitating Russia's war.
Anybody want to pick up on that, perhaps, Professor? Yeah, I imagine you would. Yeah.
Yeah, I think both China and the U.S. Are superpowers in a way. The U.S. is a superpower. China is becoming one. As superpower, both countries can only defend their interests by maintaining the international order. Okay? But maintaining international order is a very costly business. Okay? In history, according to John Kennedy, in his book, The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, he argues in history the great powers decline not because they are defeated by the rising powers, but because they are dragged down by the cost of maintaining the empire. Now it's international order. So the best strategy for China and the US is to try to make good use of the other's resources to maintain the international order rather than squandering their resources confronting each other. Ukraine, if the US is becoming a little friendlier to China, I think China would be more forthcoming on many fronts to work with the US and other countries to address the world's problems. China is pressed at the moment to resist, to protect itself from increasing US pressures.
Okay.
Either it's in form of alliances or technological, measures against China.
Interesting. I live in Germany. I've lived in Germany for quite a long time. I've lived longer in Europe than I have in North America. I'm originally from Canada, kind of lived on both sides of the Atlantic, traveled quite a bit in the world. But in Germany particularly, from an economic standpoint, I see a kind of hesitancy to take sides to some degree when it comes to China and the US. There's a lot of German companies, I mean, we're still seeing significant investments by German companies in China. BASF announced $1 billion, yeah, investment.
The Germans are a bit of an outlier in that respect.
I even asked them, I asked one of their board members about that, and they said, well, it's just a question, look at the market. The market for chemicals in the future is there. It's to 90% the way we see it. And so, it's kind of understandable. I promised I would ask you two questions, and here's one of them. Europe seems to be aiming for, to some degree, a middle way in its relations with China, maybe in economic policy. Will that position remain tenable if America pursues a more confrontational approach? Can Europe afford to sit on the fence if the US says, either you're with us or against us? Hugo, a comment on that?
I think Europe, it has already been pulled quite a bit towards the American position. And I think that whether it gets pulled further towards the American position will slightly depend on whether the American position is perceived to be a reasonable one or not. And if it's a Trump coming in, doing crazy things and picking fights with China, I think Europe might actually move a bit in the Chinese direction. Wow, you're probably picking on us all.
Yeah,
we will start to think US hegemony is a rather bad thing too.
We are actually out of time. Final question. Regarding the South China Sea and Taiwan, there's great concern about that. I do interviews on this regularly and have pundits and experts telling me, yes, there will be a hot military confrontation between the US and China in the South China Sea, if probably over Taiwan. Do you think we'll see that happen within the next 10 years, gentlemen, quickly?
Very unlikely.
Very unlikely, but not impossible.
There is a possibility of accident induced, but then you can never be certain that the DPP, the pro-independence political party, ruling party in Taiwan, would do something, extraordinary. Otherwise, we don't see a war there.
I'd say I want to say 10% chance, but it's a 10% chance of something really bad. So let's try and cut it to 2%.
Could happen, not predetermined. I agree with Hugo. If it does happen, it would be calamitous for the United States, for China, and for everyone else in the world. I also don't think that if you do get a conflict, it is going to begin with a bolt out of the blue invasion akin to what the Russians did against Ukraine back in February of 2022. We're more likely to go into gray zone activities, what we might call nibbling, and then you get onto an escalatory ladder, which becomes very difficult to get off of.
Good enough. We're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. Thank you so much. A warm round of applause for all of our panelists here. Thank you. Thank you.